Elliot's boots crunched against the thick carpet of dead leaves as he ventured deeper into the black hollow forest. The sun was already low, casting jagged shadows through the skeletal branches above. He wasn't sure why this spot called to him. Maybe it was the rumors about strange occurrences in the area, or perhaps it was the eerie, magnetic pull he felt as soon as he set foot on the trail. But as the light faded, an unnatural stillness settled around him, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. No birds chirped, no wind whispered, just an oppressive silence that pressed against his chest like a heavy weight. Suddenly he froze. A faint sound reached his ears, so soft he almost mistook it for the creak of a distant tree. But there it was again, a low, melodic whisper threading through the trees. The voice wasn't entirely clear, more like the rustling of words caught in a phantom breeze. Elliot's heart quickened as he strained to listen. Was it calling his name? Impossible. He hadn't told anyone he'd be here. Yet the whispers grew more insistent, wrapping around his thoughts like tendrils of smoke. They came from everywhere and nowhere, leading him to an area he hadn't planned to explore. As he pushed through a tangle of branches, he stumbled into a hidden clearing. The ground here was damp, covered with patches of moss that glowed faintly under the waning light. At the center of the clearing stood the mouth of a cave, partially concealed by gnarled roots and overgrown ivy. A cold breeze exhaled from its depths, carrying with it a faint metallic scent like old blood. The whispers grew louder, forming faint words. Come closer. Discover the truth. Elliot's pulse thundered in his ears. Every rational thought screamed at him to turn back, yet something primal, a blend of curiosity and dread, rooted him to the spot. His hand instinctively reached for his flashlight. As its beam cut through the cave's yawning darkness, he saw that the walls inside were etched with strange symbols. They pulsed faintly, like veins pumping with a dim, unnatural light. The whispers turned into a chorus, rising and falling in haunting harmony, as if the cave itself was alive, breathing and speaking in an ancient tongue. A sudden noise behind him made him whirl around. The forest, once silent, now seemed alive with unseen movement. Leaves rustled without wind, and shadows slithered along the ground, moving independently of the dying light. Panic clawed at Elliot's throat, but the whispers from the cave pulled him back, anchoring him like a sinister lullaby. He turned toward the cave entrance once more, its darkness now feeling less like an absence of light and more like a living void waiting to swallow him whole. Taking a shaky step forward, Elliot felt the temperature plummet. His breath fogged the air, each exhalation dissipating into the unnatural chill. The closer he got, the heavier the air became, laden with an electric charge that raised the hairs on his arms. He hesitated at the threshold, flashlight trembling in his hand. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence, so deep it felt like the world had vanished. Then, from deep within the cave, a single voice spoke, a voice that sounded eerily like his own. Elliot, we've been waiting. What secrets await Elliot inside the Cave of Whispers? Stay with us, but first, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Haunted Grounds, and prepare for what's coming next. Elliot's breath echoed off the damp stone walls as he ventured deeper into the cave. The air grew heavier, each step feeling like a deliberate act of defiance against the suffocating darkness. The symbols on the walls seemed alive, their faint glow pulsing in a rhythm that didn't match his own heartbeat, but instead mimicked something deeper, primal and unsettling. The whispers had faded, replaced by an eerie, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. As his flashlight flickered against the jagged stone, its beam fell upon an object lying in the dirt. It was a small, ornate mirror, the kind you'd find in an antique shop, its once polished silver frame tarnished and covered with grime. Something about it felt disturbingly familiar. Elliot crouched, hesitant, and reached out with trembling fingers to lift it. The moment his skin touched the cold metal, a sharp pang of recognition hit him like a bolt of lightning. Suddenly, the cave was no longer silent. Faint echoes of laughter and a soft lullaby swirled around him, growing louder with every passing second. His hand tightened on the mirror as a fragment of memory pierced through the haze of his mind. A child's hand, his own, reaching for the same mirror. He saw flashes of an old attic, dust particles suspended in golden sunlight, and a woman humming the same lullaby now echoing through the cave. It was his mother's voice, soft and soothing, but here distorted and warped, like a melody played backward on a broken record. Impossible, he whispered to himself, his voice cracking under the weight of fear. He hadn't thought of that mirror in years. It had been lost during his childhood, or so he believed. But now here it was, buried in this cursed cave waiting for him. As he turned the mirror over in his hands, its reflective surface glinted faintly despite the near-total darkness. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something move in the glass. Not his reflection, but the silhouette of a woman standing behind him, her face obscured by shadows. He whipped around, flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing there. The silence of the cave deepened, the hum intensifying, as if the space itself were mocking him. Sweat dripped down his temples as he forced himself to look back at the mirror. This time, the reflection was clearer. He saw the woman again, her eyes hollow, her face pale and gaunt. Her lips moved, though no sound escaped, forming words that Elliot couldn't understand. His hands shook violently, and the mirror slipped from his grasp, shattering against the stone floor. The lullaby stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening void. But then, from the fragments of the broken mirror, came a faint, childlike whisper. "You promised to remember." Elliot staggered back, his chest tightening as memories he had long buried began to surface. He saw himself as a child, clutching the mirror while hiding in a darkened room. There was shouting outside, angry voices, and the sound of something shattering, glass, wood, his sense of safety. And then silence. That was the day his mother disappeared, her absence unexplained, her memory tucked away in the recesses of his mind. His legs buckled under the weight of the realization. The cave wasn't just calling him, it was pulling him back to that forgotten moment, to confront the truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. But why here? Why now? As if in answer, the walls of the cave began to tremble, dust raining down in thin, choking streams. The broken shards of the mirror started to move on their own, sliding across the floor to reassemble themselves. Elliot watched in horrified fascination as the mirror's surface reformed, revealing not just his reflection, but a scene from his past. His younger self standing in the attic, staring into the mirror, as the faint shadow of a woman loomed just behind him. Her face slowly turned toward the present-day Elliot, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that froze him in place. Her mouth opened, and this time, the voice that emerged was clear. "You shouldn't have come back." The ground beneath him shifted violently, and the mirror vanished into the darkness as if swallowed whole by the cave. Elliot scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. The cave wasn't just a place, it was a trap designed to unearth the secrets of those who entered. And now it had its grip firmly on him. Whispers rose again from the walls, their tone sharper, more insistent, repeating the same words over and over. "Remember. Remember. Remember." Terror and confusion consumed Elliot as he staggered forward, deeper into the unknown, drawn by a force he couldn't resist but desperately wanted to escape. Elliot's footsteps echoed hollowly in the oppressive silence as he stumbled deeper into the cave, the air growing colder with every step. The dim light of his flashlight flickered, barely piercing the suffocating darkness. The walls seemed to close in on him, their strange glowing symbols pulsing erratically, like the frantic beat of a dying heart. The whispers, now louder and more distinct, surrounded him, overlapping into an unintelligible cacophony. His mind raced, each breath ragged, as if the very atmosphere of the cave sought to smother him. Ahead, the tunnel split into two paths, each equally foreboding. To his left, a faint, ethereal glow illuminated a narrow passage. The light danced like a flame, enticing and almost warm, but with an unsettling undertone that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. To his right, utter darkness stretched into oblivion, the whispers growing louder and more frenzied with every second. The voices from the shadows were chilling, taunting him with fragmented sentences. "Come closer. Your answers lie here. Don't run now." Elliot stood frozen, his flashlight trembling in his hand. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to flee from the unknown that lay ahead, but an invisible force held him in place. His gaze darted between the two paths, his mind flooded with questions. What was at the end of the glowing tunnel? Was it safety or a cruel illusion? And what horrors waited in the pitch-black void? His thoughts spiraled, but the cave seemed to sense his hesitation, and the ground beneath him began to tremble faintly, as if urging him to make a choice. As he stood there, paralyzed, an intense ringing filled his ears, drowning out the whispers for a moment. The noise was accompanied by a sudden flash of light from the glowing passage. In that split second, Elliot saw a vision, a glimpse of himself as a child, holding his mother's hand. They were smiling, walking along a sunlit path, a perfect memory that brought a fleeting warmth to his chest. But just as quickly as it appeared, the scene twisted into something horrifying. His mother's hand turned cold and gray, her face contorting into a grotesque mask of despair as she was dragged into the shadows by unseen forces. Her scream echoed in the cave, fading into the whispers. The darkness to his right seemed to react to the vision, growing more alive. From its depths emerged a chilling sound, a wet, dragging noise, like something heavy scraping against the stone. Elliot strained his eyes but saw nothing, only the impenetrable void. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, and mocking, as if the cave itself reveled in his torment. His throat tightened, his heart pounding as he realized he couldn't stay where he was. He had to choose. Then came the voice. It was soft at first, but unmistakably familiar, his mother's. "Elliot, my sweet boy, come to me." The sound came from the glowing tunnel, a siren call that wrapped around his heart and pulled at his deepest fears and desires. But before he could step toward the light, another voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding, "Do not trust it. It is a lie." This voice was his own, but warped, colder, as if spoken by a version of himself he didn't recognize. It came from the darkness, where the whispers had grown eerily silent. His mind fractured under the weight of the moment. The glowing path promised answers, comfort, and a possible reunion with the mother he had lost. But there was something sinister in its perfection, something that didn't sit right. The darkness, on the other hand, was pure terror, a void that seemed to devour everything, offering no promise of safety, only endless uncertainty. The choice wasn't just physical, it was existential. Each path demanded something of him, his courage, his sanity, or perhaps even his soul. The cave seemed to grow impatient, the ground trembling harder now. Dust fell from the ceiling, the air thick with the taste of iron and decay. Elliot's head throbbed as the voices from both paths merged, their words incomprehensible but filled with urgency. He clutched his flashlight, sweat dripping down his face, and took a shaky step forward. His foot hovered, his entire being trembling as he weighed the impossible decision. "Choose," the voices commanded in unison, their tone both pleading and menacing. His flashlight flickered violently, and in its dying glow, he saw something at the edge of the glowing tunnel. A figure, faint and blurry, reaching out to him with hands that didn't look entirely human. In the darkness to his right, two pinpoints of crimson light flared briefly, like eyes watching him with malevolent glee. Elliot's scream echoed into the abyss as he made his choice, stepping toward the unknown. Elliot's footsteps seemed louder in the suffocating silence of the tunnel he had chosen, each one echoing like a drumbeat in a tomb. The air grew heavier with every step, cold and damp, clinging to his skin like a shroud. His flashlight flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that danced across the uneven stone walls. The symbols etched into the rock here were different, more chaotic, their faint glow pulsating like a failing heartbeat. Whispers seeped out of the walls, soft and fragmented, yet somehow they burrowed into his mind, leaving behind a cold, gnawing dread. As he moved deeper, the whispers began to change. They no longer spoke in a language he couldn't understand. Instead, they started to mimic voices he recognized. At first, it was his mother's lullaby, soothing but warped, like a music box left out in the rain. Then came the voice of his childhood friend, calling out for help in the same desperate tone he had used the day he fell into the icy river. Finally, his own voice filled the tunnel, cracked and broken, pleading, "Why did you let me die?" Elliot's knees buckled, and he braced himself against the damp wall, his breath ragged. He knew these voices weren't real, they couldn't be, but they felt too vivid, too visceral to dismiss. The darkness pressed against him, not just as an absence of light, but as a living, suffocating force. It wasn't the kind of darkness that could be dispelled by a flashlight. It was the kind that fed on fear, growing stronger with each fleeting moment of doubt. And Elliot was drowning in it. The walls seemed to close in, their jagged edges shifting subtly as if alive. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw movement, a shadow that didn't belong to him, slithering along the wall like black smoke. He spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip, but the beam caught only empty air. The whispers grew louder now, more insistent, as if they were converging on him. "Turn back! Keep going! Join us! Run! Stay!" The conflicting messages wrapped around his thoughts, twisting his sense of direction until he wasn't sure which way he'd come. Then, without warning, the flashlight went out completely, plunging him into absolute darkness. Panic gripped him like icy fingers. He fumbled with the device, shaking it, smacking it against his palm, but it refused to come back to life. His breathing quickened, and he felt the overwhelming weight of the shadows pressing closer. Somewhere ahead, a faint light began to flicker, pale and ghostly, casting a sickly glow that barely illuminated the space around it. Elliot hesitated, but had no choice but to move toward the light. As he did, the The whispers began to form words more clearly, spoken directly into his ears. "We've been waiting for you, Elliot. Do you remember? Do you see now?" He tried to block out the voices, pressing his hands to his ears, but it was no use. The whispers weren't just external. They were inside his mind, pulling memories he didn't want to confront. The light led him into a cavernous chamber, the walls lined with jagged spikes of stone. In the center stood an ancient pedestal, its surface carved with the same symbols that had followed him through the cave. Floating above it was the source of the light, a swirling orb of luminescence, both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. As Elliot approached, he realized it wasn't just emitting light. It was alive. Faces formed and dissolved within its glow. Human faces, twisted with anguish, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural sound that resonated through the chamber. It was a voice, but not like any Elliot had heard before, layered, ancient, and impossibly vast. "Do you understand now, Elliot? Do you remember why you came?" The voice wasn't asking a question. It was pulling the answer from him, tearing through his mind for the truth. His knees gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, clutching his head as fragmented memories flashed before his eyes. The attic, the mirror, his mother's disappearance, and a cold, suffocating darkness that had haunted him ever since. From the shadows surrounding the chamber, shapes began to emerge. At first, they were indistinct, amorphous figures that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke. But as they drew closer, they took on more defined forms, faces and bodies Elliot recognized. His mother, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes lifeless. His childhood friend, soaked and shivering, his lips blue from the icy river. Himself, but not as he was now. This version of Elliot was broken, battered, and twisted, his eyes filled with hatred and despair. The figures didn't speak, but their presence filled the room with an unbearable pressure. Elliot tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The glowing orb above the pedestal pulsed rhythmically, and the shadows seemed to feed on its energy, growing more solid, more real. The voice returned, booming and final. "The shadows have always been with you. They are a part of you. Will you embrace them, or will they consume you?" Terror rooted Elliot to the spot as the shadows closed in, their icy tendrils reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. Elliot's heart raced as the shadows encroached upon him, their tendrils curling through the air like living smoke. The icy touch of one brushed against his arm, sending a jolt of pure terror down his spine. His breathing became erratic, each gasp echoing louder than the last in the cavern's oppressive silence. The glowing orb above the pedestal pulsed faster now, and with each pulse, it seemed to feed the shadows, making them darker, thicker, more alive. Elliot felt trapped, not just by the physical space, but by the suffocating presence of his own fear. The whispers returned, but this time, they didn't emanate from the walls or the shadows. They came from within him, his own voice twisted and warped. "You can't escape. You were never meant to." Each word drilled into his mind like a blade, dredging up every failure, every moment of regret and shame he had buried deep inside. He could feel his thoughts unraveling, his grip on reality slipping as the cave amplified his insecurities and magnified his darkest memories. The shadows around him began to shift, taking on distorted shapes that made his stomach churn. Faces emerged from the darkness, faces of people he had known, each one twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. His mother's hollow eyes stared back at him, her lips moving silently as if trying to speak. His childhood friend, frozen and pale, pointed a shaking finger at him, his mouth open in a soundless accusation. But the worst face of all was his own, staring back at him from the depths of the shadows, its features warped by malice and despair. Elliot stumbled backward, his hands shaking as he tried to push the visions away, but they only grew stronger. The whispers became a chorus, overlapping voices that filled the air with accusations and taunts. "You let us die. You left us behind. You are weak. You are nothing." The words clawed at his sanity, breaking through every defense he tried to muster. The shadows tightened their grip, wrapping around his legs and arms, pulling him closer to the pedestal and the pulsating orb. The light from the orb began to change, its once mesmerizing glow now flickering like a dying flame. As Elliot stared into it, he saw visions swirling within its depths, his deepest fears brought to life. He saw himself wandering alone in the endless darkness, his voice screaming for help but no one answering. He saw his mother, trapped and calling his name, her voice echoing with a desperation that broke his heart. He saw himself standing at the edge of a precipice, the shadows urging him to jump, their voices promising relief and release if he gave in. The orb's light suddenly flared, blinding him for a moment, and when his vision cleared, he found himself back in the attic from his childhood. The air was thick with dust, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the walls. The mirror sat on the floor in front of him, its surface cracked but still reflecting the room. His younger self was there, standing frozen, clutching the mirror tightly. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his lips trembling as he stared at something just out of sight. Elliot turned to see what the boy was looking at, but there was nothing, only darkness pressing against the edges of the room. The whispers filled the space again, louder now, and the shadows began to seep into the attic, twisting and writhing as they surrounded the boy. Elliot tried to reach out, to pull the child away, but his hand passed through him like smoke. The boy turned to face him, tears streaming down his face, and spoke in a voice that was both his own and not his own. "You left me here. You let it take me." The attic dissolved into darkness, and Elliot was back in the cavern, the orb flickering violently above the pedestal. The shadows coiled tighter around him, their cold seeping into his skin and freezing him to the core. His mind raced as he realized the cave wasn't just feeding on his fear. It was using it to manipulate him, to break him. But then the whispers changed, their tone shifting from accusation to seduction. "You can end this," they murmured. "We can take the pain away. All you have to do is surrender." For a brief moment, Elliot felt tempted. The weight of his fear and guilt was crushing, and the idea of letting go, of giving in, seemed almost like a mercy. But as the shadows pressed closer, he caught a glimpse of the orb again, and within its flickering light, he saw something that reignited his resolve. A faint reflection of his mother's face, not twisted or broken, but whole and strong. Her eyes seemed to plead with him, silently urging him to fight. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Elliot clenched his fists and screamed, a raw, defiant sound that echoed through the cavern. The shadows recoiled slightly, their hold loosening just enough for him to break free. He stumbled toward the pedestal, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo as the orb's light flared once more. The cavern around him trembled, the walls cracking and splintering as the shadows writhed in fury. But Elliot didn't stop. With one final burst of strength, he reached for the orb, his fingers brushing against its cold, pulsating surface. The moment he touched it, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The orb shattered in a brilliant explosion of light, and the shadows dissolved, their forms evaporating like smoke in the wind. Elliot collapsed to the ground, his body trembling, his mind reeling from the experience. As the cavern began to crumble around him, he knew the cave wasn't finished with him yet, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope amidst the terror. Elliot's body trembled as he knelt on the cavern floor, the air around him heavy with an unnatural stillness. The orb's explosion had cast the chamber into darkness, save for the faint, flickering remnants of its light that hovered in the air like dying fireflies. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight as though the cave itself were pressing down on him. The shadows were gone, but the oppressive presence remained, lingering like a predator watching from the unseen corners of the cavern. Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to shift. The stone trembled, cracks spiderwebbing outward from where the orb had shattered. A low, guttural rumble echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant, like the growl of a colossal beast stirring from its slumber. Elliot scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around, searching for a source. The whispers returned, not as disjointed murmurs, but as a singular voice, layered and commanding, vibrating in the air and in his bones. "Elliot," the voice intoned, stretching his name into a sinister chant. It was a voice unlike anything he had ever heard, ancient and otherworldly, carrying the weight of countless lifetimes. "You have come far, but you are not yet free." The words hung in the air, their meaning sinking into his mind like claws. Elliot took a step back, his heart pounding as he realized he was no longer alone. From the darkness, something emerged. At first, it was just a shifting shadow, amorphous and flickering, but as it moved closer, it began to take shape. A towering figure, its body an amalgamation of writhing shadows and distorted faces, loomed before him. Its eyes were hollow voids, and its mouth, if it could be called that, split open into a grotesque, gaping maw that seemed to consume the very light around it. The figure radiated an aura of pure malice, and Elliot could feel its gaze piercing into him, stripping him bare of every defense. "Do you understand now?" The entity spoke, its voice like grinding stone. "You are not here by chance. You were brought here, because you belong to us." The words sent a shiver down Elliot's spine. Memories flashed before his eyes, his childhood, the attic, the mirror, his mother's disappearance. The connections clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The cave wasn't just a random place he had stumbled upon. It was tied to him, to his family, to something that had been waiting for him all along. The entity raised an arm, its form shifting like smoke, and pointed toward the pedestal. In its place now stood the shattered remnants of the orb, glowing faintly. From the fragments, a new vision began to form, swirling within the light like ink in water. Elliot saw his younger self again, standing in the attic, clutching the mirror. But this time, the reflection in the mirror wasn't his own. It was the entity, its hollow eyes staring back at the child, its shadowy tendrils reaching out from the glass. The vision shifted, showing his mother pulling him away, her face pale with terror as she whispered something to him that he couldn't hear. Elliot stumbled backward, his knees weak. The vision faded, and the entity loomed closer, its form blotting out what little light remained. "She tried to save you," it hissed. "But she only delayed the inevitable. You are ours, Elliot. You always have been." The words struck him like a blow, and for a moment, he felt himself sinking into despair. The shadows around him began to stir again, creeping toward him, their whispers urging him to surrender. But then, amidst the chaos, he heard another voice, soft and faint, like a distant echo. "Elliot, fight!" It was his mother's voice, cutting through the darkness like a blade. He turned toward the sound, his heart clinging to it like a lifeline. The glow from the orb fragments intensified, and within their light, he saw a faint image of her, her hand outstretched, her expression filled with both sorrow and determination. Summoning every ounce of strength, Elliot stood tall, his fists clenched. The entity's form wavered, its hollow eyes narrowing as if in anger. "You think you can defy us?" it snarled, its voice shaking the cavern. The shadows surged forward, but Elliot didn't move. He stepped toward the pedestal, toward the glowing fragments, ignoring the icy tendrils that clawed at his body. As his hand reached for the light, the entity let out a deafening roar, and the cavern began to collapse. Stone shards rained down, the air thick with dust and the sound of splitting earth. But Elliot didn't falter. He grabbed the fragments, their cold light burning into his skin, and held them high. The light erupted, blinding and pure, pushing back the shadows and illuminating the chamber. The entity screamed, its form unraveling as the light consumed it. "This is not the end," it bellowed, its voice fading into nothingness. The cavern shook violently, and Elliot felt the ground give way beneath him. As he fell into the abyss, the light surrounded him, pulling him into its embrace. The last thing he saw was his mother's face, her eyes filled with pride and sadness, before everything went dark. Elliot awoke to an unbearable silence. The light that had engulfed him was gone, replaced by an impenetrable darkness that stretched endlessly in every direction. The air was thick and cold, clinging to his skin like a damp shroud. His limbs felt heavy, his body aching as though he had been torn apart and reassembled. He forced himself to stand, the ground beneath him feeling strange, neither solid stone nor earth, but something softer, yielding, and disturbingly warm. His heart raced as he strained to see, his eyes adjusting to the void. Then, a faint glow appeared in the distance, pulsating like a dying heartbeat. The light was dim and sickly, casting long shadows that slithered across the ground like living things. Instinctively, Elliot moved toward it, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. With every step, the whispers returned, growing louder and more distinct. They no longer spoke in fragmented phrases. They were coherent now, unified in a chorus of malice. "Elliot, you cannot escape. You belong here." As he approached the source of the light, his surroundings began to take shape. He found himself in a vast, circular chamber, the walls towering high above him and lined with jagged, blackened stone. At the center of the room stood a massive throne, carved from the same writhing shadows that had tormented him earlier. The throne pulsed with an eerie glow, and seated upon it was the entity, its form even more terrifying than before. Its body was a shifting mass of darkness, its hollow eyes now burning with an intense, crimson light. Tendrils of shadow extended from its body, writhing and twisting as though eager to consume. "You have come far, Elliot," the entity boomed, its voice reverberating through the chamber. "But this is where your journey ends. You have seen the truth, and now you will take your place." Elliot's fists clenched as he took a step forward, defiance rising within him despite the terror clawing at his mind. "I don't belong to you," he said, his voice trembling but firm. The entity let out a low, rumbling laugh, a sound that echoed with centuries of malevolence. "You are mistaken," it replied, its tendrils extending toward him. "Your fear, your pain, they have always been mine. You carry me within you, Elliot. I am the shadow that has haunted your life, the void you could never escape. And now, you will complete what was begun long ago. The ground beneath Elliot's feet trembled as the entity's tendrils lunged toward him. He barely managed to dive out of the way, the shadows striking the ground where he had stood, leaving scorched marks in their wake. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The entity's laughter filled the chamber, and the whispers rose again, louder than ever, filling his mind with doubts and fears. Elliot's gaze darted around the room, searching for anything he could use against the monstrosity. His eyes fell on the remnants of the orb, scattered near the base of the throne. The shards still glowed faintly, their light flickering like a dying flame. He didn't know why, but he felt a pull toward them, a faint hope that they might hold the key to defeating the entity. Summoning his courage, Elliot sprinted toward the shards, dodging the tendrils that lashed out at him. Each step felt like a battle against the overwhelming weight of fear and despair, but he pushed forward, refusing to let the shadows consume him. As he reached the shards, the entity roared, its voice shaking the chamber. "You cannot defy me. You are nothing without your fear." Elliot grasped the largest shard, its surface cold and sharp, cutting into his hand. The light within it flared briefly, and for a moment, he felt a surge of strength. The whispers in his mind faltered, their chorus breaking apart as if the shard's light disrupted their hold. He turned to face the entity, the shard glowing brighter in his grip. "I may have been afraid," Elliot said, his voice steady now, "but I'm not yours. Not anymore." The entity howled in rage, its tendrils converging on him in a furious assault. In the final moment, Elliot raised the shard high, its light exploding outward in a blinding flash. The chamber was consumed by the brilliance, the shadows disintegrating under its radiance. The entity screamed, its form unraveling, its hollow eyes fading into nothingness. As the light dimmed, Elliot collapsed to the ground, the shard slipping from his hand. The chamber was silent now, the oppressive darkness replaced by a strange, peaceful stillness. He looked up to see the remnants of the throne crumbling, the shadows retreating into the walls, leaving behind a faint, lingering glow. But as Elliot caught his breath, he noticed something. The shard in his hand was no longer glowing, but its surface now reflected his own face, twisted and distorted, with eyes that glowed faintly red. A whisper echoed in his mind, faint but unmistakable. "This is not over." The chamber began to dissolve around him, the ground falling away into nothingness. Elliot closed his eyes as the world around him vanished, his mind haunted by the final remnants of the entity's voice. Elliot awoke to the sound of rushing water. His body was sprawled on the forest floor, damp leaves clinging to his skin, and the cool air biting at his cheeks. The night sky stretched above him, filled with a strange, unnatural stillness. The stars, usually a source of comfort, seemed distant and cold, their light faint against the blackness that surrounded him. He blinked, trying to piece together what had happened, but his mind was a haze of fractured memories and vivid terror. Pushing himself to his feet, he looked around. The forest was eerily quiet, no chirping insects, no rustling leaves, only the faint hum of the nearby stream. He turned, expecting to see the cave entrance, but there was nothing. The thick undergrowth he had pushed through earlier was undisturbed, the ground unmarked by his passage. It was as though the cave had never existed. His heart pounded in his chest as he clutched the shard still in his hand. Its surface was dull now, its glow extinguished, but its weight felt heavier than before, as though it carried something unseen. He stared at it, unease creeping into his thoughts. The shard reflected his face, but there was something off, a flicker of movement, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. For a moment, he thought he saw the faint outline of the entity's hollow eyes staring back at him, but when he blinked, it was gone. Elliot's grip tightened on the shard as a familiar whisper brushed against his ear, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. "Elliot," he spun around, flashlight trembling in his other hand, but the forest remained empty. Yet, the feeling of being watched was undeniable, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The whisper came again, this time closer, almost playful. "Did you think it would end so easily?" Panic surged through him as he began to walk, then run, trying to put distance between himself and the unseen presence. The forest seemed endless, each tree a shadowy sentinel blocking his escape. The air grew colder, the ground softer, until his steps began to sink into the earth. He stopped, looking down, and realized he was standing in a pool of dark water. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. It was the entity's, its hollow eyes glowing faintly beneath the surface. He stumbled backward, the shard slipping from his grip and splashing into the water. Elliot's breath hitched as ripples spread across the surface, distorting the reflection. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the forest, no longer disjointed but a single, unified voice. You cannot run from what you are. The water began to churn, the reflection rising as though something beneath it was trying to break free. He turned and ran, the sound of the whispers following him like a shadow, their cadence matching his frantic heartbeat. He burst into a clearing, collapsing to his knees, gasping for air. When he looked up, he froze. In the center of the clearing was the mirror, the same ornate, tarnished mirror he had found in the cave. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting the forest around him, but the reflection wasn't right. The trees looked darker, more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And standing among them was a figure, himself, but not quite. This other Elliot stared back at him, its eyes glowing red, a faint smirk twisting its lips. The reflection moved, stepping closer to the surface of the mirror. Elliot's chest tightened as the whispers grew deafening, the voices layering into a symphony of mockery and menace. The other Elliot raised a hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass, its expression filled with malice. The surface rippled, and cracks began to form, spiderwebbing outward like frozen lightning. "You can't escape me," the reflection said, its voice a perfect mimicry of his own. "I am you, and I always will be." The glass shattered, and Elliot shielded his face as shards flew past him, cutting through the air with a sound like breaking bones. When he looked again, the mirror was gone, replaced by nothing but the empty clearing. But the whispers remained, softer now, fading into the wind, but never truly gone. He felt the weight of the shards still in his pocket, its presence a cold reminder of what had transpired. As he stumbled out of the forest, dawn breaking on the horizon, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that the entity had left something behind. Not in the cave, not in the mirror, but within him. Every shadow seemed to shift when he passed, every whisper of wind carrying his name. The further he walked, the more certain he became that this was far from over. What would you do if the darkness followed you home? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Haunted Grounds for more stories that will keep you awake at night.